Hello there, and welcome to our channel, where we settle into quiet and let the mysteries of the world find us before we sleep. This is not a standalone documentary. This is part of a series, and each episode reveals something that changes everything. Tonight, we are heading somewhere most of us will only ever see in dreams. A place so remote that it feels less like a part of our world and more like a secret held by the planet itself. Antarctica. For centuries, it has remained a vast, white silence, a continent wrapped in ice that was never meant for our footsteps. It is a realm where time is measured in the slow creep of glaciers. But humans have always been drawn to the forbidden. We look at the blank spaces on the map and whisper, "What if?" Tonight, let us settle in and wonder what might be waiting beneath the frozen armor of a land that was never meant to be explored. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a library hundreds of years ago. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment and beeswax, and the only light comes from the flickering amber glow of a candle. You pull a map from a shelf, a heavy roll of vellum that crackles as you spread it across a wooden table. You see the familiar shapes of Europe, the jagged coastline of the Mediterranean, and perhaps a vague, distorted outline of the Americas. But as your eyes drift toward the bottom of the page, the world simply stops. There's a vast, empty space, a blankness that feels almost like a silent scream. In those days, that empty space was not just a lack of information. It was a mirror for everything humans feared and everything they desired. Long before the first ship ever crunched through the pack ice, Antarctica existed as a ghost. It was a myth that weighed heavily on the human mind, a land that we had already named and populated with our imagination before we even knew if the ground beneath it was real. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. And tonight, as we look back to the layers of history, it feels as though that early obsession was the first sign that we were chasing something we were never truly meant to find. Before we go any further, I want you to take a second and just listen to the quiet around you. Is it the kind of quiet that feels peaceful, or is it the kind that makes you wonder if something is missing? For the ancient Greeks, the world without a southern continent felt lopsided. It felt wrong. Philosophers like Aristotle, and later the geographer Ptolemy, believed in a concept called symmetry. They looked at the massive land masses of the north and decided that for the earth to remain stable and not tip over in the heavens, there simply had to be an equal amount of land in the south. It was a mathematical necessity born of a desire for balance. They did not have satellites. They did not have long-range ships. They only had the logic of their own minds, and that logic told them that a great continent must be down there, somewhere beyond the burning heat of the equator and the stormy seas that no one had yet dared to cross. This was the birth of the Southern myth. It was a land born of a thought, a place that had to exist because we wanted the world to make sense. And because it was born in our minds, we filled it with wonders. If you look at maps from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you will see this myth in full bloom. Map makers would draw massive, sprawling coastlines that stretched across the bottom of the globe. Because they had never seen it, they were free to invent it. They drew lush forests, exotic animals, and even cities with golden spires. They imagined a paradise that balanced the familiar struggles of the North. To the people of that time, the unknown South was not a wasteland of ice. It was a promise. It was the last great secret of the earth, a place where the rules of the known world might not apply. But as the centuries passed and explorers began to push further south, the myth started to change. It began to take on a heavier, more forbidding tone. The sailors who ventured into the southern oceans spoke of a cold that felt like a physical weight. They talked about the sky turning a bruised metallic gray and the waves rising like mountains of dark glass. They spoke of the silence. It was not the soft silence of a snowy evening, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow the sound of their voices. One of the most famous figures in this struggle was Captain James Cook. In the late 1700s, he sailed further south than anyone before him. He circled the entire continent, coming within miles of the coast, but he never actually saw the land. All he saw was ice. Miles and miles of towering white walls, frozen barriers that seemed to tell him to turn back. Cook was a man of immense courage, but even he felt the weight of that place. He wrote in his journal that if there was a continent further south, it would be a place of eternal frigidity, a land doomed by nature never to feel the warmth of the sun. He believed that no human would ever venture further than he had, and that the world would gain nothing from exploring such a desolate realm. Cook's words were a warning, a sign that the paradise we had imagined was actually a fortress. He was essentially saying that the earth had a basement, and it was locked for a reason. But the southern myth was too strong to be killed by a few cold reports. Instead of disappearing, the myth simply moved. If the surface of Antarctica was a frozen desert, then surely the secrets must be hidden beneath the ice. This is where the story starts to feel a bit like a dream that turns into a fever. Once we realized that Antarctica was not a lush garden, we began to project our oldest mysteries onto its frozen face. We started to wonder if it was the site of the lost Atlantis, or if it held the remains of a civilization that had existed before the Great Flood. The ice became a shield, a way to explain why we had never found these people before. We told ourselves that they were still there, preserved in the frost, waiting for us to develop the technology to reach them. It is a strange human trait, is it not? When we find a place that is clearly hostile to our existence, we do not simply walk away. We become more curious. We treat the danger as a challenge, and we treat the silence as a secret. We look at a continent that is 99% covered in ice, where the wind can strip the skin from your face in minutes. And we say, what are you hiding? The weight of this myth is why Antarctica feels different from any other place on Earth. When you go to the ruins of Rome or the pyramids of Egypt, you are walking through a history that has already been told. The stones are there, and the stories are written in the books. But when you look toward the South Pole, you're looking at a history that is still a blank page. It is a place that has been protected by the most extreme conditions on the planet, almost as if nature itself was trying to keep our curiosity at bay. Think about the sheer scale of the ice for a moment. In some places, it is over 2 miles thick. If you stood on the actual ground of Antarctica, there would be enough ice above your head to bury several skyscrapers stacked on top of each other. That much pressure does things to the mind. It makes us think about time in a way that is hard to grasp. That ice has been there for millions of years. It has watched the rise and fall of every empire we have ever known. It has stayed silent while we fought wars and built cities and invented machines. When we talk about the myth of the South, we are really talking about our own desire to find something that is untouched by the messiness of human life. We want there to be a place that is still pure, even if that purity is cold and deadly. We want there to be a library of the Earth's memory that we haven't yet spoiled. But there's a price for that kind of curiosity. To explore Antarctica is to go against the very grain of the environment. We have to bring our own air, our own warmth, our own food. We have to live in tiny metal pods that are the only thing standing between us and a world that wants to freeze us solid. The ancient map makers were right about one thing. Antarctica does balance the world, but it doesn't do it through landmass alone. It balances us psychologically. It represents the limit of our reach. It is the place where the maps stop being useful and start being warnings. For a long time, the myth was enough. We were happy to dream of what might be down there, But then, we decided we had to know for sure. We decided that we could peel back the ice and read the secrets underneath. Tonight, as we settle into this story, I want you to keep that feeling of the unknown southern land in your mind. Think about the sailors who looked at the horizon and saw only ice, but still believed there was a golden city just past the next berg. Think about the maps that were filled with monsters, because the map makers couldn't imagine a world that was simply empty. And think about why, even today, when we have satellite images of every square inch of the surface, we still feel that pull. We still look at the white expanse and wonder if the myths were actually right all along. We are standing on the edge of a story that is as old as human thought. It is a story of a place that was never meant for us, but a place that we could not leave alone. The weight of the Southern myth is the weight of our own expectations, our own need for the world to hold secrets that are bigger than we are. And as the wind begins to howl in our imagination, we realize that the real exploration is only just beginning. We are about to go beneath the layers of frost and into the heart of the great silence. We're going to look at the maps that shouldn't exist and the fossils that tell a story of a green world that was swallowed by the dark. The myth is shifting into reality, and reality is far stranger than anything Ptolemy could have dreamed. Let us take a deep breath and prepare to see what the ice has been protecting all these years. Imagine for a moment that the world has edges. Not the kind of edges you find on a map or a computer screen, but real physical boundaries that tell you quite clearly that you have gone far enough. For the sailors of the 18th and 19th centuries, Antarctica was not a destination. It was a rumor wrapped in a shroud of fog. It was a ghost that haunted the southern horizon, and to reach it, you had to pass through what many described as a wall of mist and ice. This was not just a weather pattern. It was a psychological barrier that felt almost intentional, as if the earth itself were trying to hide something precious or perhaps something dangerous from the prying eyes of humanity. If you've ever been on a boat when the fog rolls in, you know how the world shrinks. The horizon vanishes. The sky and the sea become a single gray void. Now, imagine that feeling, but in the coldest, most violent waters on the planet. The Southern Ocean is not like the Atlantic or the Pacific. It is a place of screaming winds and waves that can tower 10 stories high. The sailors called these latitudes the Roaring Forties, the Furious 50s, and the Shrieking 60s. And as you moved deeper into that cold, the mist would thicken. It was a heavy, wet blanket that smelled of salt and ancient snow. And inside that mist there were shapes, massive, white cathedrals of ice, drifting silently through the gloom. These were the icebergs, the sentinels of the South. They were the first sign that you were approaching a world that was never meant to be explored. For centuries, this wall of mist kept the secret of the continent. Even the most daring explorers like Captain James Cook sailed around an entire landmass without ever actually seeing it. He came so close. He saw the birds. He felt the sudden drop in temperature. He saw the ice blink, that strange, white glow on the underside of the clouds that signals ice is nearby. But the mist was too thick. The ice was too jagged. In his journals, he wrote that no man would ever venture farther than he had, and that the lands which might lie to the south would never be explored. There is a certain weight to those words, isn't there? A sense of finality. It wasn't just that it was hard to get there. It felt forbidden. When the mist would finally part, what the early explorers saw was even more intimidating than the fog. They found the Great Ice Barrier. Today we call it the Ross Ice Shelf, but back then it was simply the wall. Imagine a cliff of solid, white ice rising 200 feet out of the dark water. It stretches for hundreds of miles, a perfectly flat, vertical precipice that looks less like a natural formation and more like a fortress. There are no harbors. There are no beaches. There's only the wall, for the men standing on the wooden decks of their ships, looking up at that massive, frozen rampart. The message was clear. This is the end of the world. Beyond this point, there is only the unknown. There is a strange beauty in that kind of isolation. It makes you wonder why we are so driven to peek behind the curtain. Why couldn't we just leave the mist alone? Perhaps it is because humans have a difficult time with silence. We want to fill it with our voices, our stories, and our maps. But Antarctica has a way of swallowing those things. In the 19th century, when the first sightings were finally confirmed, the mystery didn't go away. It only deepened. Because once you pass through the mist, once you find a way to scale the wall, you realize that you haven't really entered new land. You have entered a different time. The light in Antarctica does strange things to the mind. There's a phenomenon called a whiteout, where the clouds and the snow reflect the light so perfectly that all shadows disappear. You lose your sense of depth. You lose your sense of up and down. You can be walking toward a massive mountain and think it is just a small drift of snow at your feet. Or you can reach out to touch a wall of ice that is actually miles away. It is a place of optical illusions and mirages. Sailors used to report seeing entire cities in the distance, with towers and spires made of crystal. They saw ships sailing through the air. They saw mountains that weren't there. We know now that these are just superior mirages caused by temperature inversions. But to a tired, cold sailor, they felt like glimpses into another realm. They felt like the mist was playing tricks on them, trying to lead them astray. And then there is the sound, or rather, the lack of it. People who have spent time on the ice often talk about the silence of the mist. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, expectant silence. It is the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. It makes you hear the blood rushing in your ears. When the wind stops, the world feels like it is holding its breath. And when the ice moves, it doesn't just crack. It groans. It whispers. It sounds like a living thing shifting its weight beneath a heavy blanket. If you were standing there, thousands of miles from a nearest city, wouldn't you start to wonder if the ice was hiding something? Wouldn't you start to project your own questions onto that blank, white canvas? The wall of mist and ice was more than just a physical barrier. It was a guardian. It protected the continent for millions of years. It kept the fossils of tropical trees and ancient reptiles safe from the wind. It kept the subglacial lakes sealed in total darkness. And it kept our imagination fed. Because as long as the mist was there, Antarctica could be anything. It could be a paradise. It could be a wasteland. It could be the home of a lost civilization that moved south when the world was young. Think about the sailors who first saw the smoke of Mount Erebus. Imagine sailing through a world of white and gray, through a wall of fog that chills you to bone, and then suddenly seeing a volcano rising out of the ice, spitting fire into the polar sky. It would feel like a contradiction. Fire and ice existing in the same impossible space. It reinforces the idea that Antarctica is a place where the normal rules of the world don't apply. It is a place of extremes. It is a place where the earth is still raw and unfinished. Tonight, as you listen to the quiet sound of your own world, try to imagine that wall. Think about the cold, damp mist pressing against the hull of the ship. Think about the white glow of the ice shelf appearing through the gloom. There is a comfort in knowing that such places exist. There is a peace in the idea that some parts of our world are still protected by a shroud of mystery. We live in a time where almost everything is mapped and measured. We have satellites that can see the license plate on a car from space. But even today, the ice under Antarctica remains largely unseen. The mist has simply moved from the surface to the layers beneath. We often talk about the explorers who made it through. We talk about their courage and their endurance. But we rarely talk about what it felt like to be the one who had to turn back. Imagine the frustration of being just miles from the coast, seeing the faint outline of mountains through the fog, and having to turn your ship around because the ice was closing in. It must have felt like the continent was actively pushing you away. It was a rejection. Antarctica was saying, not yet. Or perhaps it was saying, not ever. The wall of mist and ice is still there in many ways. It exists in the technical challenges of drilling through the glaciers. It exists in the difficulty of landing a plane on a moving sheet of ice. And it exists in the way we still talk about the continent as a place of secrets. It is a final frontier of our own planet. And as we continue to wonder what lies beneath, we have to respect the barrier. We have to understand that the mist was put there for a reason. Take a moment to settle deeper into your surroundings. Let the thought of that distant, cold wall make your own space feel even warmer. The story of Antarctica is a long one, and we are only just beginning to peel back the layers. But for tonight, it is enough to stand at the edge of the mist. It is enough to look at the wall and wonder what has been protecting all these years. There is a beauty in the not knowing. There is a peace in the shroud. Because as long as the mist remains, the mystery stays alive. And as we drift further into the history of this frozen world, we will see that every time we think we have broken through the wall, we find another one waiting for us, even deeper and even colder than the last. In the long, drifting history of our world, there is a recurring theme that keeps us awake at night, wondering. It is the idea of a ghost, not the kind that rattles chains in an attic, but a geographical ghost, a place that everyone seemed to know was there, even before a single soul had actually seen it. For centuries, Antarctica was exactly that. It was a whisper in the ears of sailors and a shadow on the charts of map makers. It was a ghost among the waves, a silent presence that people were so certain that they drew it into existence on their maps, often with shocking detail, long before the official history books say it was discovered. Before we dive into the mystery of these impossible maps, take a second to settle in. Where are you right now? Are you tucked under a heavy comforter, feeling the cool air on your face while the rest of your room stays warm? Or perhaps you are sitting in a quiet kitchen, watching the reflection of the moon in a glass of water. Wherever you are, I want you to imagine for a moment that the world you know is suddenly much larger and stranger than the maps on your phone tell you. Imagine that there's an entire continent out there, waiting in the dark, and though nobody has found it yet, you can feel it pulling at your imagination like a magnet. That is how the world felt for the great navigators of the past. They spoke of a land they called Terra Australis Incognita, or the unknown southern land. They believed it had to be there because the earth needed balance. If there was a great weight of land in the north, there must be an equal weight in the south to keep the world from tipping over. It was a theory based on symmetry and beauty, but it led to something that science still struggles to explain today. This brings us to one of the most famous ghosts in the history of exploration. It is a piece of gazelle skin parchment, drawn in the year 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. If you were to look at this map today, it might look like just another antique chart, filled with sailing ships and strange sea monsters. But when you look closer, the ghost reveals itself. The map shows the western coast of Africa and the eastern coast of South America with a level of detail that seems impossible for the 16th century. But it is what lies at the bottom of the map that makes people stop and catch their breath. Piri Reis drew a coastline that stretches across the Southern Ocean, curving along the bottom of the world. Some researchers have looked at this coastline and compared it to the modern maps of the Antarctic shore. Specifically, they point to a region called Queen Maud Land. What makes this so haunting is that the map seems to show the coastline without its ice. It shows mountains, bays, and rivers that we now know exist, but they are currently buried under miles of frozen water. Official history tells us that this coastline has been covered by ice for millions of years. It tells us that Piri Reis could not have known what was under there. And yet, there it is, a phantom coastline drawn 300 years before the first humans supposedly set eyes on the continent. Piri Reis himself wrote in his notes that he did not invent these shapes. He said he compiled his map from over 20 older source maps, some of which he claimed went back to the time of Alexander the Great. It makes you wonder, does it not? If he was telling the truth, it means that somewhere in the deep, forgotten past, someone saw Antarctica. Someone mapped it when it was green, or at least when its shores were clear of the white armor that guards it now. This is the ghost among the waves. It is a possibility that our history is not a straight line, but a series of circles. It suggests that we might not be the first to explore the world, but merely the latest. There is another map drawn by Orontius Phineas in 1531. That is perhaps even more unsettling. It shows the entire continent of Antarctica, placed squarely at the bottom of the world. It shows the mountains that we now call the Transantarctic Range. It shows the rivers and the valleys. But once again, it shows them as if the ice did not exist. For a long time, historians simply said these maps were mistakes. They said the map makers were just guessing, or that they were accidentally drawing the coastline of South America and stretching it to fit the page. But as our technology has improved, as we have used radar to peel back the ice and see the land underneath, the resemblance has become harder to ignore. We are finding that the ghosts on those old parchments match the reality of the rock. How is that possible? How can a map from the 1500s describe a world that was supposed to be hidden until the 1900s? It feels as though we are catching glimpses of a memory that was never meant to be ours. It feels as if Antarctica was never meant to be explored because it was already finished, a completed chapter of a book that was closed before we were even born. Now, as you listen to this, try to picture the sailors who actually ventured into those waves. The Southern Ocean is not like the Atlantic or the Pacific. It is a place of giants. Sailors speak of waves as tall as office buildings, and winds that never stop screaming. They call these latitudes the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and the screaming 60s. For centuries, these waves acted like a wall. They were the guardians of the ghost. Every time a ship tried to head south, the ocean pushed it back. The cold would settle into the wood of the ships until they groaned like living things. The rigging would freeze solid, turning the sails into sheets of iron that could snap a man's fingers. One of the greatest sailors to ever live, Captain James Cook, spent years trying to find this ghost. He circled the entire continent, coming closer than almost anyone before him. He saw the ice fields. He saw the towering bergs that looked like floating cathedrals. But he never saw the land. He wrote in his journals that if there was a land to the south, it would be a place of such horrible cold that no human could ever survive there. He believed that the world ended in ice, and that nothing lay beyond it but silence. Cook was a man of facts and numbers, yet even he felt the weight of the unknown. He was sailing through the waves, looking for a ghost he could never quite catch. And then, in the early 1820s, the ghost finally became solid. 3 different expeditions, one Russian, one British, and one American, all claimed to have seen the land at roughly the same time. The Russian expedition, led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, is often credited with the first sighting. Imagine being on his ship, the Vostok, as it cut through the fog and the spray. Imagine the moment the mist cleared, And instead of seeing just more water or another iceberg, you saw a dark, jagged line of rock on the horizon. A place that only lived in myths and impossible maps for thousands of years was suddenly there, real and cold and indifferent to your presence. But here is the strange part. Even after they found it, Antarctica remained a ghost. Even when they landed on it, they could not truly see it. They were standing on the surface of a continent, but that continent was buried. They were walking on top of history, separated from it by 2 miles of ice. It is like standing on the roof of a house and trying to describe the furniture inside. You know the house is there. You can feel the shape of it under your boots, but you are still an outsider. Maybe that is why these old maps haunt us so much. They represent a version of Antarctica that we can never have, a version that was open and exposed, a version that breathed. Today, we look at the ice and we see a barrier. We see a place that was never meant to be explored. But when we look at the Piri Reis map, we see a place that was known. We see a ghost that was once a living thing. It makes the world feel a little bit more mysterious, does it not? It makes you think that perhaps there are other ghosts out there, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for us to find the right map. As you drift closer to sleep tonight, let the image of that ghost continent stay with you. Think of the waves of the Southern Ocean, endlessly crashing against a wall of ice that hides a world of mountains and rivers. Think of the Admiral Piri Reis, sitting in a room filled with ancient scrolls, trying to piece together a puzzle that he did not fully understand. We are all just pieces of that same puzzle. Try and make sense of a world that is much older and much deeper than we usually admit. The ice of Antarctica is a shield, but it is also a mirror. When we look at it, we see our own curiosity reflected back at us. We see our need to find what is hidden. But sometimes, the ghost among the waves reminds us that some things are meant to stay hidden. Some stories were finished long ago, and we are just the ones who found the book in the attic, long after the ink has dried. Rest now, knowing that the world still has its secrets. The waves will keep crashing, and the ghosts will keep waiting. And as we continue to peel back the layers of this frozen mystery, we find that the most incredible discoveries are not always what we find on the ground, but what we find in the silence between the waves. Before we venture deeper into the heart of the continent, into the places where the ice is 2 miles thick and the silence is absolute, we have to spend some time at the edges. Because before Antarctica was a place for science, before it was a stage for heroes and explorers, it was a place of profit. It was a place where the mystery first met the knife. It is a chapter of history that we often skip over, because it is not as noble as a race to the South Pole or as captivating as the search for lost civilizations. But it is essential to understanding why Antarctica feels so haunted today. We call this era the Red Harvest, a time when the fringes of the frozen world were stripped of their life before the rest of the world even knew the continent existed. Think back to the late 1700s. The world was still expanding, and the maps of the far south were nothing but giant, empty circles. Sailors and merchants didn't look at those blank spaces and wonder about ancient ruins or the origin of the earth. They looked at them and wondered if there was anything left to sell. At that time, the northern oceans were already starting to grow quiet. The great hunts of the north had thinned the populations of seals and whales. The industry needed a new frontier, and so they began to push further south than anyone had ever dared to go, into the fog and the ice of the Southern Ocean. Imagine being on one of those early sailing ships. They were small wooden vessels, often no longer than a modern house, tossing on waves that could rise as tall as a building. There was no heat, no reliable way to communicate with the world, and no guarantee that you would ever see land again. These sailors were the first humans to truly encounter the Antarctic fringes, but they weren't explorers in the way we usually use the word. They didn't want to be famous. In fact, many of them wanted to be invisible. When a sealer found a new island, like the South Shetlands or the South Orkneys, they didn't rush home to announce it to the geographic societies. They kept it a secret. They wanted those beaches all to themselves. They would return to port with hulls full of thousands of skins, and when other captains asked where they had been, they would lie. They would point to a different part of the map, or tell stories of islands that didn't exist. This is one of the reasons why the official discovery of Antarctica is so messy. By the time the explorers arrived in 1820, the sealers had likely been there for years, working in the shadows, leaving no record behind except for the empty beaches they left in their wake. It was a brutal, quiet expansion. The harvest of the first seals was so rapid and so total that it remains one of the fastest environmental collapses in history. In a single season, a few ships could clear an entire island of its life. The men would land on the rocky shores, surrounded by thousands of seals that had never seen a human before and had no reason to fear them. It wasn't a hunt so much as a slaughter. The ice and the rocks were turned red, a stark, violent contrast to the white and blue of the frozen landscape. This was the Red Harvest, a period where the mystery of the South was greeted not with wonder, but with a club. Have you ever thought about how strange it is that we started killing a place before we even knew what it was? We often think of exploration as the first step, followed by exploitation. But in Antarctica, it was often the other way around. The greed for fur and oil was what pushed the ships into the ice, and the exploration was just a byproduct of the search for more life to harvest. By the time the first scientists landed, the echoes of the Red Harvest were already fading into the wind. But as the seals vanished, the industry turned its eyes to something even larger, the whales. And this is where the scale of the Red Harvest becomes truly difficult to grasp. If you were to visit the fringes of Antarctica today, specifically places like South Georgia or Deception Island, you would find the skeletons of a massive industrial past. You would see rusted iron tanks as big as houses, rotting wooden piers, and mountains of bleached white bones. These were the whaling stations, the outposts of a global industry that treated the Southern Ocean like a factory. The silence of Antarctica today is a relatively new thing. 100 years ago, these fringes were loud. They were filled with the sound of steam engines, the shouts of thousands of men, and the constant heavy smell of burning oil. From the early 1900s until the mid-20th century, the waters around the continent were the site of the largest whale hunt in human history. Blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks. They were pulled from the water in numbers that are almost impossible to imagine. In some seasons, tens of thousands of whales were processed at these stations. There's a place called Grytviken on the island of South Georgia. Today, it is a quiet museum, a stop for tourists who want to see the grave of the explorer Ernest Shackleton. But when you walk through the ruins of the station, you can still feel the weight of the harvest. You see the flensing plans, those massive wooden platforms where the whales were carved apart. You see the boilers where the blubber was melted down into oil that lit the streets of Europe and lubricated the machines of the world. It feels like a ghost town from a different planet. The Red Harvest of the fringes tells us something important about why Antarctica was never meant to be explored. It shows us that when we do reach these remote places, we often bring our most destructive habits with us. The continent was protected for millions of years by its isolation and its weather. But as soon as we found a way to bridge that gap, the harvest began. The mystery of what lay beneath the ice didn't matter as much as what could be taken from the water. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If we were so quick to strip the life from the edges, What would we have done if we had found something in the center? If the first explorers had found gold or oil or something even more valuable beneath the 2 miles of ice, would Antarctica even exist as we know it today? Or would it have been carved up and consumed just like the seals and the whales? There's a haunting quality to the remains of this era. On some of the remote islands, you can still find the small stone huts built by sealers 2 centuries ago. They are tiny, cramped spaces where men live for months in the freezing dark, surrounded by piles of skins, waiting for a ship that might never return. These men saw the southern lights and the towering icebergs long before the world knew they were real. They lived in the heart of the mystery, but they were there to destroy part of it. They were the pioneers of the fringes, but their stories are written in blood and oil rather than in journals of discovery. The whaling era eventually ended, not because we realized it was wrong, but because we ran out of whales. The industry collapsed when there was nothing left to harvest. It was only then, as the stations were abandoned to the rust and the snow, that Antarctica began to return to its silence. The whales began a long, slow recovery, and the seals returned to the beaches. But the marks are still there. If you look closely at the ice on some of the sub-Antarctic islands, you can still find traces of soot from the old boilers. The red harvest left a permanent stain on the history of the continent. This part of the story changes how we look at the modern research stations. When we see those high-tech buildings today, filled with scientists studying the stars and the ice, we have to remember that they are standing on the shoulders of the sealers and the whalers. The maps they used were often started by men who were looking for a place to hide their catch. The paths through the ice were first found by ships looking for a pod of whales. The exploration of Antarctica is inseparable from its exploitation. As you sit there tonight, maybe listening to the wind outside your own window, try to imagine transition that happened on those frozen shores. Imagine the thousands of years of silence that existed before the first wooden ship appeared on the horizon. Then imagine the century of noise, the red harvest, the blood on the ice, and the smoke in the air. And then, finally, imagine the silence returning. But this time, it is a different kind of quiet. It is the silence of a graveyard. It is the silence of a place that has been stripped and then left behind. Antarctica's fringes are a reminder that the continent has always been a place of extremes. Extreme beauty, extreme danger, and extreme loss. The red harvest was the first time that humanity truly tested the limits of the frozen world. We pushed until the life was gone, and then we stopped only because we were forced to. It sets a strange tone for the rest of human history on the continent. It makes the pursuit of science and the protection of the environment feel like an apology for what happened at the start. But perhaps there is another way to look at it. Perhaps the red harvest was the moment Antarctica bit back. The weather, the ice, and the sheer distance made the industry incredibly expensive and dangerous. It was never an easy profit. The continent didn't give up its riches without a fight, and in the end, it was the environment that won. The stations rusted away, the ships sank, and the ice remained. The red harvest ended, and the mystery of the interior stayed intact, protected by the very things that made the harvest so difficult. As we move away from the bloody beaches and the rusted tanks, we are left with a question that still hangs over the ice today. If we found something else, something hidden deep beneath the layers of history we talked about before, would we be different this time? Have we learned the lessons of the red harvest? Or is our curiosity just a more polite form of the same hunger that drove the sealers? The fringes are quiet now, and the penguins walk among the rusted boilers of the old stations. Nature is slowly reclaiming the ruins, turning the iron to dust and the wood to rot. But the story of the red harvest remains a vital part of the Antarctic legend. It is a reminder that this continent was never meant to be a factory, and that every time we try to turn it into one, the ice and the silence eventually have the final word. Now, we turn our gaze away from the red-stained rocks of the coast and look toward the white horizon of the interior, because as the harvesters left, a new kind of person arrived. These were people who didn't want the oil or the fur. They wanted something much harder to catch. They wanted the truth about the earth itself. And as we leave the ruins of the fringes behind, we begin to see that the real secrets of Antarctica were never on the beaches at all. They were waiting, perfectly preserved, in the deep, cold dark where no hunter could ever reach. If the ice is a thick, frozen shield, then the forces moving beneath it are the invisible hands that guide the story of this continent. It is one thing to look at a glacier and feel small, but it is another thing entirely to watch your instrument spin and realize that the ground itself is vibrating with a history we cannot see. Tonight, as we continue our journey, we move away from what we can touch and into the realm of what we can only detect. We are heading into the magnetic void, a place where the rules of the world seem to thin out, and where the very earth under the ice behaves in ways that baffle even the most prepared explorers. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in the center of a vast, white desert. There are no landmarks, no trees, no mountains on the horizon to guide your eyes. You have a compass in your hand, a simple tool that has guided humanity across oceans and through forests for centuries. But here, in this frozen silence, the needle begins to twitch. It does not point north with a steady, certain confidence. Instead, it drifts, it circles. It seems to be searching for something that isn't there, or perhaps it is reacting to something far too large to comprehend. This is the beginning of the magnetic void. It is the feeling of being in a place that the planet has not quite finished explaining to us. Scientists who spend their lives studying Antarctica speak of anomalies. An anomaly is really just a polite word for a mystery that has a number attached to it. It is a spike on a graph or a dip in a reading that tells us the geology below is not what it should be. In the region known as Wilkes Land, there is a disturbance so massive that it stretches across 150 miles. It is a magnetic anomaly that suggests something heavy, something dense, and something ancient is buried deep beneath the ice. Some look at the data and see a crater, the scar of an asteroid that struck the Earth millions of years ago with enough force to change the course of life itself. But others, the ones who let their minds wander in the quiet hours of the polar night, wonder if it could be something else. They see the symmetry of the readings and imagine structures. They see the depth and imagine a vault. This is the irresistible pull of the magnetic void. When we cannot see the ground, we rely on our machines to be our eyes. But when the machines show us shapes that do not fit our understanding of nature, the human imagination rushes in to fill the gap. We are wired to find patterns in the chaos. We want to believe that a triangular spike in a radar scan is a pyramid because a pyramid is a human story. We want to find walls in the ridges of subglacial mountains because walls imply that we were here before. In Antarctica, the line between a geological formation and a forgotten monument becomes very thin, especially when you are looking at it through the green glow of a monitor while the wind howls outside your research station. But let us think about the void itself. Why does it capture us so? Perhaps it is because Antarctica is the only place left on our planet that truly feels like it belongs to the stars. When we map the magnetic fields of Mars or the Moon, we find similar anomalies. We find places where the crust holds onto ancient secrets that the surface has long forgotten. Antarctica is our piece of the alien world, tucked away at the bottom of the globe. It is a place where the Earth's magnetic field lines converge and tangle, creating a chaotic environment that has as much in common with deep space as it does with a quiet meadow. There are also the ghost mountains, the ranges that rise as high as the Alps but remain forever in the dark. These mountains create their own magnetic shadows. When the first surveys flew over the center of the continent, they did not expect to find anything but flat bedrock. Instead, they found a jagged, violent landscape of peaks and valleys, all encased in a tomb of ice miles deep. These mountains are not just rocks. They are the anchors of the magnetic void. They distort the signals we send down, reflecting them back in patterns that suggest a world far more complex than a simple frozen desert. Think about the sailors of the past, the ones who drew sea monsters on the edges of their maps. They did not do that because they were foolish. They did it because the void demanded a story. When you look at a blank space, your mind cannot help but populate it with the things you fear or the things you hope for. Today, we do not draw monsters. We draw magnetic maps. We look at the red and blue swirls on a digital display, and we whisper about what they might represent. Is that dense mass a deposit of iron, or is it the foundation of something that existed before the ice arrived? The magnetic void is also a place of silence. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes when your electronics fail. Many pilots who have flown over the Antarctic interior have told stories of their instruments going dark for no apparent reason. Radios crackle with static that sounds like voices, and navigation systems lose their lock on the world above. In those moments, you are truly alone. You are suspended between a sky that has no landmarks and a ground that you cannot see. It is a humbling reminder that even in our age of satellites and instant connection, there are still places that can cut us off. There are still voids that we cannot bridge with a signal. As we settle into this thought, let yourself feel the weight of that silence. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, expectant one. It is the silence of a library where the books are written in a language you cannot yet read. Every magnetic spike is a word. Every anomaly is a sentence. We are still learning the alphabet of this continent, trying to understand how a place so cold and so still can be so geologically loud. The void is not a lack of information. It is an abundance of information that we do not yet have the keys to unlock. There is a sense of mystery here that is almost physical. It is like the feeling of a heavy curtain that you are not allowed to pull back. We know that the earth beneath the ice has lived many lives. It has been a forest. It has been a swamp. It has been a volcanic ridge. The magnetic void preserves the signatures of all those lives at once. It is a layered history, compressed and distorted by the weight of the ice above. When we measure the magnetic field, we are listening to the echoes of those past lives, all shouting at us from beneath the glaciers. And what about the people who go there? The scientists who spend months in the interior, living in small huts while they map these invisible forces. They speak of a strange exhaustion that comes not just from the cold, but from the environment itself. The magnetic void seems to affect the human spirit as much as it affects a compass. Some say the lack of natural cycles and the constant presence of the magnetic disturbances leads to vivid dreams and a feeling of being watched by the landscape itself. It is as if the continent is trying to communicate to the only channel is left, the invisible pulse of the earth. We often talk about Antarctica as a place that was never meant to be explored, and perhaps the magnetic void is the most literal expression of that. It is a natural barrier that goes deeper than the ice. It is a shield of interference that keeps us from seeing clearly. But for the curious, a barrier is just a reason to look closer. We continue to fly our planes and drill our cores because we cannot stand the thought of a secret being kept from us. We want to know what is at the center of the anomaly. We want to see the face of the ghost mountains. Tonight, as you listen, imagine those invisible lines of force. They are swirling around the South Pole like a slow, magnetic hurricane. They are dipping into the crust and bouncing off ancient stone. They are the heartbeat of a continent that is still very much alive, even if it is trapped in a frozen sleep. The void is not a place to be feared, but a place to be respected. It is a reminder that the world is much deeper and much stranger than the maps in our pockets suggest. When we finally understand the magnetic void, what will we find? Will it be the simple truth of iron and basalt, or will it be the confirmation of our wildest dreams? Will it be the ruins of a time we don't remember, or the blueprints for a future we haven't reached? Until then, the needle continues to spin, the instruments continue to glitch, and Antarctica remains, as it always has been, the greatest mystery on the face of the earth. The void is waiting, and we are just beginning to listen to what it has to say. The wind is picking up now, and the blue light of the ice is starting to fade into the deep purple of the polar night. Let yourself drift with the magnetic lines. Let your mind wander into the subglacial valleys where the ghost mountains stand in their eternal darkness. We are small and the void is large, but there is a cozy comfort in knowing that there are still places that refuse to be fully known. It is enough for now to simply wonder. It is enough to be a visitor in the magnetic void, watching the needle spin and knowing that some secrets are meant to be kept in the cold. If you have been with us for the last few chapters of this story, you might have started to feel the weight of the ice. You might have begun to sense the way Antarctica pushes back against a curious mind. But there's a difference between visiting the ice during the brief, frantic window of the summer and actually living with it when the seasons turn. Tonight, as we settle into a quieter space, I want you to imagine that the sun is finally doing something it has been threatening to do for weeks. It is dipping toward the horizon, but this time it is not coming back. For the people who stay behind on the continent after the last planes apart, this is the beginning of the long dark. It is a period where the continent truly becomes its own sovereign realm, a place where humans are no longer visitors, but are effectively trapped in a frozen vault. It is a strange thought, is it not? To be in a place where the sun sets in late April and does not rise again until August. For months, the only light comes from the moon, the stars, and the flickering, ghostly curtains of the aurora australis. But before we get to the beauty of the lights, we have to talk about the silence and the psychological weight of the grip. Antarctica was never meant to be a home for us. And the winter is when the land makes that most clear. When the darkness settles in, the environment shifts from being merely harsh to being actively hostile. The temperatures drop to levels that seem like they belong on another planet, often falling below minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, the physical world behaves differently. Steel can become brittle and snap like glass. Fuel can turn into a thick, unusable jelly. Even the breath from your lungs can crackle in the air, a phenomenon called the PSHSH of the stars, where the moisture in your breath freezes instantly and falls to the ground in a tiny, audible shower of ice. Maybe you are listening to this while tucked away in a room that feels safe and steady. Perhaps you can hear the distant hum of a heater or the sound of a car passing by outside. In the Antarctic winter, the sounds are different. There is the moan of the wind against the metal of the research stations, a sound that never quite goes away. There is a sharp, gunshot crack of the ice shifting under its own massive weight. And then there is the interior silence. This is what the explorers of the past feared most. They called it the silence that screams. When you are deprived of the normal sounds of life, of birds or trees or water, your mind starts to manufacture its own noise. The first group of humans to truly experience this was the crew of the Belgica in 1898. They were a group of explorers led by Adrien de Galache, and they found themselves trapped in the pack ice of the Bellingshausen Sea. They had not planned to stay the winter. Their ship was not prepared for it, and neither were their minds. As the sun vanished and the ice squeezed the hull of their vessel, the crew began to unravel. It was more than just the cold or the scurvy that threatened them. It was a psychological isolation. They lived in a world of gray and black. They lost their sense of time. One by one, the men began to suffer from profound melancholy. One sailor even began to walk away from the ship across the ice, claiming he was going home to Belgium. He was walking into a void of certain death, driven by a brain that had simply had enough of the dark. This is a condition that modern scientists still study, often called T3 syndrome. It is a biological response to the extreme cold and the lack of sunlight. The thyroid hormones in the body begin to shift, and the result is a peculiar kind of Antarctic fugue state. People become forgetful. They might walk into a room and completely forget why they are there. They might stare at a wall for an hour, lost in a thought that has no beginning or end. On the stations today, they call it the Antarctic stare. It is a reminder that our brains were built for cycles of light and dark, for the rhythm of a world that has seasons we can survive. When you remove those things, the mind begins to drift like a ship without an anchor. But even in the grip of the long dark, there is a beauty that is almost impossible to describe. If you were to step outside a station like the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in the middle of July, you would see a sky that is clearer than anywhere else on Earth. Because the air is so cold, it holds almost no moisture, which means there is no haze. The stars do not just twinkle, they blaze. They look like diamonds set into a velvet canopy. And then there are the auroras. Imagine curtains of green, violet, and crimson light dancing across the sky, so bright that they cast shadows on the snow. It is a light that feels ancient, almost supernatural. In those moments, the explorers of old felt like they were standing in the presence of something divine, or perhaps something alien. Yet, the beauty is a mask for the danger. In the winter, you cannot just step outside for a walk. You have to layer yourself in specialized gear, a process that takes 20 minutes just to prepare for a 5-minute task. If a storm rolls in, a condition called a whiteout can occur in seconds. In a whiteout, the sky and the ground become the same shade of milky white. You lose your sense of up and down. People have been known to get lost just 10 feet from the door of their station, wandering in circles until the cold takes them, unable to find the very building that would save their lives. The continent is always looking for a way to reclaim the space we have carved out of it. Think about the men of Shackleton's crew on Elephant Island. They spent their winter huddled under 2 overturned lifeboats. They were wet, they were cold, and they were living on a diet of seal meat and limpets. They lived in a constant state of semi-darkness, listening to the roar of the Southern Ocean just feet away from their heads. What kept them alive? It was the storytelling. They would hold mock trials, sing songs, and talk about the meals they would eat when they finally returned to a world of green grass and warm rain. They had to build a world of the mind to replace the world they had lost. Even today, with our internet and our satellite phones, the winter-over crews speak of a strange phenomenon. They call it the world shrinking. As the months of darkness go on, the outside world starts to feel like a dream. News from home feels distant and unimportant. The only thing that is real is a small group of people in the station and the infinite cold outside. It is a form of sensory deprivation that changes you. When the sun finally does return in August, it is a moment of profound emotion. Many people cry when they see the first sliver of gold on the horizon, but they also find that they are different people than they were when the sun last set. They have a piece of the ice inside them now. The winter in Antarctica is a reminder that there are still places on our planet that do not want us. We can build our steel pods and our heated laboratories, but we are always just guests on the edge of a void. The long dark is a season of reflection, a time when the continent pulls its blanket of ice tight and settles into a sleep that has lasted for millions of years. For those who stay, it is a test of what it means to be human in the absence of everything that makes our lives comfortable. As we think about that darkness tonight, let it be a way to appreciate the small comforts around you, the light of a lamp, the sound of your own breathing, the knowledge that tomorrow the sun will rise again. Antarctica is a place of extremes, but also serves as a mirror for our own resilience. It shows us that even in the deepest grip of the winter, there is a spark of human curiosity that refuses to be extinguished. But as the wind howls outside the frozen windows of the mind, we must always remember that the ice is patient. It has all the time in the world, and it knows that eventually the dark always returns. We are moving now toward a different kind of mystery, one that lies not in the darkness of the sky, but in the secrets held within the very structure of the ice itself. Because if the winter is a test of the soul, the ice is a record of everything the world has ever been. And as the long dark begins to lift in our story, we find ourselves looking closer at the frozen archive that has been waiting for us to read it. The long dark is a threshold, and once you cross it, the continent never looks the same again. It becomes a place of ghosts, of echoes, and of a history that is much older than any of us can imagine. As we settle back into the quiet of our own spaces tonight, I want you to imagine a time when the maps of our world still had a hole at the bottom, a place where the line simply stopped and the ink gave way to a vast, shimmering whiteness. For centuries, as we have discussed, this was the terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, that mystery began to pull at the human heart in a way that was almost obsessive. It was no longer enough to wonder what was there or to look at old maps and speculate about lost civilizations. The world was shrinking. The telegraph was connecting cities. Steamships were crossing oceans. And yet, there sat Antarctica, silent and sovereign, like a fortress that had never been breached. This period is often called the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, but I think it is more accurate to call it pilgrimage, because for the men who set their sights on the geographic South Pole, that invisible point at the bottom of the world became more than just a destination. It became a frozen altar, a place where they would lay down their comfort, their health, and in many cases, their very lives. If you are listening tonight from a place that is warm and safe, it is difficult to grasp the scale of the ambition that drove these explorers. There was no satellite navigation. There was no radio contact. Once they stepped off the wooden decks of their ships and onto the ice, they were as isolated as if they had landed on the moon. They were moving into a landscape that was never meant for humans. A place where the air is so dry it cracks the skin, and the wind is a constant, screaming presence that never truly leaves you. But the pull was irresistible. To be the first to stand at 90 degrees south was the last great prize of the terrestrial world. And that prize set the stage for one of the most famous and tragic rivalries in human history. The race between Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott. Roald Amundsen was a man of the north. He grew up in Norway, a land of snow and skis, and he approached Antarctica with a cold, calculating precision of a master craftsman. For Amundsen, the pole was a target to be hit. He did not go there to find himself or to write poetry. He went there to win. He understood that to survive in a place as hostile as the frozen continent, you had to work with the environment rather than against it. He looked to the indigenous people of the Arctic for his lessons. He learned the value of sled dogs, those incredible animals that could thrive in the cold and pull heavy loads across the ice. He wore skins and furs that breathed, rather than the heavy wools favored by the British. Amundsen was a ghost on the ice. He moved quickly, he moved efficiently, and he moved with a singular focus that left no room for error. On the other side of this race was Captain Robert Falcon Scott. Scott was a romantic, a naval officer, and a man who saw exploration as a noble, scientific endeavor. To Scott, the South Pole was not just a geographic coordinate. It was a test of character. He did not want to just reach the pole. He wanted to reach it in a way that reflected the strength and endurance of the British spirit. This meant that he leaned into the struggle. He brought motorized sledges that quickly broke down in the cold. He brought ponies that were ill-suited for the deep snow and the freezing winds. And most significantly, he relied on man-hauling. This is exactly what it sounds like. Men harnessed the heavy sleds, dragging hundreds of pounds of gear across the ice by the sheer strength of their own muscles and will. It was slow. It was exhausting. And in the thin, oxygen-starved air of the high Antarctic plateau, it was a slow form of suicide. As we think about these two men tonight, it is easy to see them as symbols of different ways of relating to the unknown. Amundsen represents the practical, the survivor who respects the limits of the world and moves within them. Scott represents the dreamer, the one who believes a human can overcome any obstacle, even the laws of nature themselves. And as they both moved south, the continent began to reveal its true character. Antarctica is not just a place of ice. It is a place of psychological weight. When you are out there on the polar plateau, there is no sound except for your own breath and the crunch of snow under your feet. There are no trees. There are no animals. There is only the horizon, flat and white, stretching out forever. It is a sensory deprivation chamber on a continental scale. Many explorers spoke of the madness that starts to creep in when the world becomes that empty. You start to see things. You start to hear voices in the wind. The silence becomes a physical weight that you have to push against every single day. Amundsen reached the South Pole first, on December 14, 1911. He stayed for 3 days, performed his measurements, left a small tent with a letter, and turned back. His return journey was a masterpiece of logistics. He arrived back at his base camp healthy and victorious, having conquered the last great secret of the earth. But for Scott, the story was very different. When Scott and his 4 companions finally reached the pole a month later, they were already exhausted and suffering from the early stages of scurvy and frostbite. And there, in the middle of that vast, empty wilderness, they saw it, a small black flag fluttering in the wind. The realization that they had been beaten was a crushing psychological blow. Scott wrote in his diary that the pole was a horrible place, and even more so for having failed to reach it first. They had reached the frozen altar, but they found that someone else had already made the offering. The return journey for Scott and his men is one of the most harrowing stories ever told. As the Antarctic autumn began to set in, the temperatures dropped to 40 and 50 degrees below zero. The ice became like sandpaper, making it nearly impossible to drag the sleds. They were starving, their bodies literally consuming themselves for fuel. One by one, the men began to fail. Edgar Evans was the first to go, his mind and body breaking under the strain. Then there was Lawrence Oates, a man who realized that his frostbitten feet were slowing down the rest of the group and risking their lives. In one of the most famous moments of quiet heroism, he stepped out of the tent into a blizzard and said, "I am just going outside, and maybe some time." He walked into the white and was never seen again. He sacrificed himself on that frozen altar in a desperate hope that his friends might live. But Antarctica does not always accept the sacrifices we offer. Scott and his final two companions, Wilson and Bowers, made it to within only 11 miles of a massive food and fuel depot that could have saved them. But a fierce blizzard pinned them in their tent for days. They were too weak to move, and their supplies were gone. In those final days, Scott wrote letters. He wrote to his wife. He wrote to the mothers of his men. And he wrote a message to the public. He did not write with bitterness. He wrote with a strange, quiet dignity. He spoke of the risks they had taken and the bad luck that had found them. But he also spoke of the beauty of the struggle. When their bodies were found months later, they were frozen in their sleeping bags. Scott had his arm thrown over Wilson, his lifelong friend. They were found with 35 pounds of geological samples, rocks they had carried all the way from the mountains because they refused to give up their scientific mission even as they were dying. Tonight, as we reflect on this great race, we have to wonder why we are so drawn to the story. Is it because of the victory of Amundsen or the tragedy of Scott? I think it is because Antarctica forced these men to show who they truly were. In the world of cities and ships, we can hide behind our titles and our clothes. But on the frozen altar of the high plateau, there is no hiding. The continent strips away everything until only the core of the person remains. It is a place that was never meant to be explored, a place that resists human presence with every blizzard and every crevasse. And yet we went. We pushed into the silence, and we left our footprints and our stories in the snow. When we think about Antarctica as a place that was never meant to be explored, we are talking about this fundamental conflict, the human desire to know the unknown, and the Earth's silent refusal to be known. Scott and his men are still there, in a way. Their tent was covered by the snows of a century, and they are now encased in the ice, slowly moving with the glacier toward the sea. In another few hundred years, they will reach the edge of the continent and be carried away in an iceberg, returning finally to the ocean. It is a haunting thought that the ice keeps what it takes. It preserves a memory of the struggle and the cost of the quest. As we move forward in our journey through this history, keep the image of that small black flag in your mind, the image of the empty plateau and the men who walked into it knowing they might never walk out. The heroic age was a time of grand gestures and terrible losses, but it was also the moment when Antarctica stopped being a myth and started being a reality, a harsh, cold, and demanding reality. It was the moment we realized that if we were going to occupy this space, we would have to pay for it in ways we never imagined. The frozen altar had been claimed, but the continent was only just beginning to reveal its secrets. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of the vastness of that plateau and the quiet that has returned to it now that the explorers are gone. It is a quiet that is older than we are, and it is a quiet that will remain long after our own stories have been written. The great race was over, but the mystery of the ice was only deepening. And in that depth, we find the next chapter of our story, one that moves from the surface of the ice into the strange and wonderful things that live in the shadows of the coldest place on Earth. There is a specific kind of sound that wood makes when it is being asked to do something impossible. It is not just a snap or a crack. It is a slow, groaning protest, a series of high-pitched shrieks and deep, guttural thuds that tell you the physical world is reaching its limit. In the year 1915, in the middle of the Weddell Sea, 28 men lived inside that sound every single day. They were the crew of the Endurance, a ship whose name would eventually become a definition for the human spirit. But at the time, she was simply their only home in a world that wanted them gone. If Antarctica is a place that was never meant to be explored, then the Endurance is the ultimate proof of the continent's resolve. It is a story of how a vessel built by the finest craftsmen of Norway, designed specifically to withstand the crushing embrace of polar ice, was eventually reduced to splinters by a sea that refuses to be tamed. Ernest Shackleton, the leader of this ambitious expedition, had a dream that was as grand as it was dangerous. He wanted to lead the first party to ever cross the Antarctic continent from sea to sea. It was a goal born of an era where the map was almost finished, and the last few blank spaces were calling out to men who felt the need to prove something to the world. But Antarctica does not care about human ambition. It does not recognize the glory of a flag or the pedigree of an explorer. To the ice, the Endurance was not a marvel of engineering. She was merely an intruder, a small splinter of oak and fir trying to navigate a landscape of shifting white mountains. By January of 1915, the ice decided it had seen enough. The pack ice of the Weddell Sea is not a flat, static surface. It is a churning, grinding jigsaw puzzle of frozen plates, some of them miles across, and others the size of city blocks. They are constantly moving, driven by currents and winds that no human can control. The Endurance found herself caught in a lead of open water that suddenly vanished. One moment, there was a path forward, and the next, the jaws of the ice snapped shut. The ship was not wrecked, at least not yet. She was simply held. She became a part of the ice, a tiny wooden island drifting wherever the sea chose to take her. Imagine for a moment what that life must have felt like. You are hundreds of miles from the nearest human being. You are on a ship that is no longer a ship, but a stationary building locked in a frozen desert. The sun disappears for months at a time, leaving you in a twilight world of blue shadows and howling winds. And yet, inside the Endurance, there was a strange, cozy kind of defiance. Shackleton knew that the greatest danger was not the cold, but the silence. He kept his men busy. They played football on the ice. They held dog races. They sang songs around a banjo in the evenings. They turned their predicament into a routine, trying to ignore the fact that the ice beneath them was always moving, always tightening its grip. As the months passed, the pressure began to change. The ice was no longer just holding the ship. It was trying to occupy the space where the ship was. In the darkness of the Antarctic winter, the crew would hear the ice screaming. It sounds like distant artillery or the roar of 1,000 lions. It is the sound of millions of tons of frozen water pressing against each other. And in the middle of it all was the Endurance. She was built with a hull so thick and a frame so strong that she was supposed to rise above the pressure, to be squeezed upward like a wet bar of soap. For a while, she did exactly that. She groaned and she tilted, but she held. But by October, the sea decided it would not keep her any longer. The pressure became something monstrous. The oak beams, some of them nearly a foot thick, began to bend like twigs. The decks began to buckle, and water started to seep through the seams. Shackleton walked onto the ice and looked back at his ship, realizing that the battle was over. He gave the order to abandon ship. It is one of the most haunting images in the history of exploration. 28 men, standing on a floating cake of ice, watching their only hope of safety being slowly devoured by the earth itself. They removed their sledges, their dogs, and their meager supplies, and they sat in the snow as the Endurance was crushed. She did not go quickly. She fought for her life for weeks. The mast snapped and fell like broken limbs. The rigging turned into a tangled web of frozen rope. On November 21st, 1915, the ice finally opened its hand just enough to let her go. The bow dipped. The stern rose into the air, and the Endurance slid beneath the surface, leaving nothing but a hole in the ice that froze over almost immediately. To the men watching, it must have felt like the end of the world. They were now truly alone, with no ship, no radio, and no way for the outside world to find them. The story of how those men survived is a legend of its own, but tonight Let's think about the ship herself. For over 100 years, the Endurance remained a ghost. She sat at the bottom of the Weddell Sea, 3,000 meters down, in water so cold and so dark that it feels like the deep reaches of space. Because the water is so frigid, the wood-consuming worms that usually destroy shipwrecks cannot survive there. The Endurance was not just sunk, she was preserved. She became a time capsule, a perfect monument to the moment she was lost. In March of 2022, a team of modern explorers and scientists set out to find her. They use autonomous underwater vehicles and the latest technology to scan the sea floor in the very place where Shackleton had recorded his final position. Against all odds, in one of the most difficult environments on the planet, they found her. The images that came back were breathtaking. The Endurance is sitting upright on the seabed, looking almost exactly as she did the day she went down. You can see the gold lettering of her name across the stern. You can see the ship's wheel, the brass fittings, and even the scattered remains of the crew's belongings on the deck. She looks as though she is simply resting, waiting for a crew that will never return. Finding the Endurance was more than just a scientific achievement. It was a bridge across time. It reminded us that the stories we tell about Antarctica are not just myths. They are rooted in the physical reality of oak, iron, and ice. The ship is a witness to the fact that Antarctica is a place of absolute power. It is a continent that does not negotiate. It does not offer second chances. You can bring the strongest ship in the world. You can bring the bravest men. And the ice can still decide on a whim to erase you. When we look at the footage of the wreck, it is hard not to feel a sense of profound quiet. She is so well preserved that it feels like Shackleton might walk across the deck at any moment. But she is also a reminder of the silence that defines the far south. She is part of the library of history we talked about earlier, but she is a volume that was written in tragedy and rediscovered in awe. The sea would not keep her in the world of the living, but it kept her perfectly in the world of the lost. The story of the Endurance teaches us something about the nature of exploration itself. We often think of it as a conquest, as a way of planting a flag and saying we own a piece of the map. But Shackleton and his men learned that exploration is actually an exercise in humility. You go into the unknown not to master it, but to see if you can endure it. The ship was lost. The mission was a failure by every traditional measure. And yet, because Shackleton refused to lose a single man, it became one of the greatest triumphs in human history. As we think about that ship resting in the dark, 3 kilometers beneath the ice, it gives us a different perspective on the continent above. Antarctica is a place that guards its secrets with a cold ferocity. It kept the Endurance hidden for over a century, wrapped in the dark and the cold, far beyond the reach of human hands. It only allowed us to see her again when we had developed the technology to match its harshness. And even now, she remains out of reach, a protected monument that no one is allowed to touch. She is a ship that the sea will not keep, and yet she is a ship the sea will never let go. She sits there as a reminder that the blank spaces on our maps are never truly empty. They are filled with the remnants of our daring, the fragments of our dreams, and the quiet, enduring presence of the earth itself. The Endurance is a symbol of what happens when we try to cross the boundaries that nature has set. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we are crushed, but sometimes, in the middle of that failure, we find something that lasts forever. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet of that shipwreck. Imagine the absolute stillness of the water at the bottom of the world. There are no storms there. There is no grinding ice. There's only the long, cold memory of a time when 28 men looked at the end of their world and decided to keep going. The Endurance is still there, And in a way, she will always be there, guarding the gate to a continent that was never meant to be explored, but will always be wondered at. It is a story of wood and ice, but more than that, it is a story how even in the coldest place on Earth, the memory of human courage can remain perfectly preserved, waiting for someone to find it and remember what it means to endure. For hundreds of years, the only way to know Antarctica was to touch it, to feel the bite of the wind against your skin, to hear the crunch of the ice under your boots, and to measure the continent one agonizing step at a time. It was a slow crawl against an infinite white wall. But as the 20th century began to unfold, the human story took a dramatic turn. We found a way to rise above the physical barriers that had kept us at bay. We found wings. And with those wings, the great white silence was broken by the mechanical roar of engines, changing our relationship with the frozen South forever. Tonight, I want you to imagine that transition. Think about the silence of a place that has not heard a sound louder than a gale for millions of years. Then, imagine the first time a tiny, fragile airplane buzzed across that horizon. It must have felt like an intrusion, like a needle piercing a veil that was never meant to be lifted. When we took the sky over Antarctica, we were not just exploring a new place. We were looking down at a world that had remained hidden from every living creature since the dawn of time. Richard Byrd is a name that most people think of when they imagine this era. In 1929, he and his team set out to do what once seemed impossible, to fly to the South Pole and back. For Byrd, the airplane was not just a tool. It was a key. It allowed him to see in hours what it had taken Shackleton and Scott months to even attempt. But flying in Antarctica was not like flying anywhere else on Earth. The continent has a way of tricking the eyes and the instruments of anyone who dares to hover above it. Have you ever experienced a true whiteout? It is a phenomenon where the sky and the ground become indistinguishable. There are no shadows, no horizons, and no landmarks. You are suspended in a void of pure, milky light. For a pilot in those early days, a whiteout was a death sentence. Without a horizon to guide them, they could be flying upside down or heading straight into a mountain without ever knowing it. It was as if the continent itself was trying to blind those who try to look down upon it. It was a reminder that even if we could fly over the ice, we were still at the mercy of its whims. Byrd and his crew flew a plane called the Floyd Bennett. It was a heavy, 3-engine machine that struggled with the thin, cold air of the high polar plateau. To reach the pole, they had to fly over the Queen Maud Mountains, a range of jagged peaks that rose up like teeth to snap at the belly of the plane. They were carrying too much weight. The plane would not climb high enough to clear the pass. In that moment, they had to make a choice. They had to throw out their survival supplies, their food, and their extra gear, just to gain a few hundred feet of altitude. It was a gamble of the highest stakes. If they crashed, they would have nothing to sustain them. They were trading their safety for a glimpse of the forbidden. As they cleared those peaks and looked down at the polar plateau, they saw something that no human being had ever witnessed. An endless, flat expanse of white that seemed to go on into eternity. From that height, the scale of Antarctica becomes terrifying. You realize that it is not just a continent. It is a planet unto itself. A world where the rules of life do not apply. Byrd described the feeling as one of deep humility. You are a tiny speck of metal and fuel floating over an ocean of ice that does not care if you exist. The compasses were another problem. Near the poles, magnetic compasses become erratic. They spin and twitch, uselessly trying to find north or south that is constantly shifting beneath you. The pilots had to rely on sun compasses and pure intuition. It was as if the Earth's own magnetic field was trying to scramble the thoughts of the intruders. The deeper they flew into the interior, the more the world seemed to pull away from them. But even with the danger, the view from above began to peel back the layers of mystery. They saw mountains that no human had ever named. They saw glaciers that flowed like slow, frozen rivers into the sea. They began to map the blank spaces on the globe. But I wonder, does mapping a place make it less mysterious? Or does it just give the mystery a name? When Byrd looked down at the South Pole, he did not find a monument or a marker. He found only more white, more silence. He dropped the weighted American flag and turned back, leaving the pole to its solitude once again. There is a strange loneliness in polar flight. When you are on the ground, you are part of the landscape. You are fighting it, yes, but you are connected to it. When you are in the air, you are a ghost. You are hovering over a world you cannot touch. You see the vastness of the crevasses, those deep blue cracks in the ice that could swallow a city block, and you realize how fragile your position truly is. If that engine coughs, if a single bolt snaps, you are no longer a ghost. You are a permanent part of the silence. The aviation age in Antarctica also brought the first glimpses of things we still struggle to explain. Pilots began reporting strange sightings. Some spoke of mountains that seemed to glow with an internal light. Others described mirages, so vivid they looked like cities on the horizon. These are often explained as superior mirages, where temperature inversions in the cold air bend light and create images of things that are hundreds of miles away. But for the men in those cockpits, staring out at the endless white, it felt like the continent was showing them visions of what it used to be, or perhaps what it was hiding. Think about the silence of the cockpit once the engine is turned off after landing on the ice. The transition from the mechanical scream to the absolute quiet of the desert. It must have been deafening. The explorers of the air were the first to truly understand the sheer size of the great unknown. They could see for hundreds of miles in every direction, and yet they saw nothing but the same frozen armor. It was as if the more they saw, the more they realized how much was still hidden. The ice is not a flat surface. It is a heavy, miles-thick shroud. From the air, you can see the ridges and the swells of the land underneath, but you can never quite reach it. The flights of the 1920s and 30s changed the map, but they did not change the heart of Antarctica. They only confirmed that the continent was a place of extremes that defied human presence. Every time an airplane landed, it was a miracle of engineering and luck. The skis would stick to the frozen snow like glue. The oil in the engines would turn to the consistency of honey. The metal would become so brittle it could snap like glass. We were using the best technology of our age, and it was barely enough to survive a single afternoon in the Antarctic sky. As Byrd and others like Lincoln Ellsworth continued to fly, they discovered the last great mountain ranges and the hidden heart of the continent. They named lands after their wives, their patrons, and their friends. Marie Byrd Land, Ellsworth Land. The names were a way of staking a claim, of trying to make the alien familiar. But the names never really stuck to the ice. The ice does not care about our names. It only cares about the wind and the sun. Tonight, as you listen to quiet around you, think about those wings over the silence. Think about the brave, perhaps foolish, men who climbed into those tin boxes and flew into a void where no one could help them. They were the ones who finally saw the full scale of the blank space on the map. They were the ones who realized that Antarctica was not just a destination. It was a warning that there are parts of this world that are not for us. No matter how high we fly, no matter how fast we go, the great white silence remains. It is a silence that has existed since before the first human spoke a word, and it is a silence that will likely remain long after our last engine has stopped humming. The aviation era did not conquer Antarctica. It only gave us a better view of our own limitations. It showed us that even from the sky, the continent is a vault. We can fly over the lid, we can take photographs of the lock, but we are still standing on the outside. The wings gave us speed, but they could not give us a home in the ice. And as the pilots flew back toward the sea, leaving the interior to the shadows and the wind, they must have felt a sense of relief. The relief of leaving a place that was never meant to be seen. There's a certain beauty in that, I think, the idea that even in our modern world, there's a place that remains truly wild, a place that resists the camera and the map, a place where the sky is a mirror and the ground is a memory. And as we close this chapter of our journey, we are left with the image of those tiny planes, like silver flies against a white sheet, soaring over a world that is still waiting for its secrets to be told. The wings are gone now, replaced by satellites and drones, but the silence they once disturbed is still there. It is waiting for us to stop talking, stop flying, and simply listen to what the ice has to say. The story of flight in Antarctica is a story of human ambition meeting a force that cannot be bargained with. It is a story of how we try to rise above the cold, only to find that the cold reaches all the way to the stars. And as we settle into the rest of our evening, let that thought stay with you. The image of a lone plane, thousands of feet in the air, surrounded by a world of white, moving toward a horizon that never ends. It is a lonely thought, but it is also a beautiful one. It reminds us that there are still horizons worth reaching, even if we are not meant to stay. Sometimes the most peaceful-looking places have the most turbulent stories hidden just beneath the surface. We have spent so much time tonight talking about ancient myths and the slow memory of the ice. But there is another layer to the story of Antarctica, one that is made of steel, diesel, and the shadows of a world at war. It is a chapter where the quietest continent on Earth became a backdrop for human power struggles. A place where the silence of the glaciers was broken by the thrum of engines and the cold calculation of military strategy. If you are still settled in, maybe with a warm drink or tucked under a heavy blanket, take a breath with me, because we are moving from the realm of legends into the realm of iron and blood. It is strange to think about war in a place where no one actually lives. But as the world began to tear itself apart in the middle of the 20th century, even the far south was not out of reach. The story of the secret wars in Antarctica really begins with a sense of desperate curiosity. In the late 1930s, the world was on edge. Nations were looking for resources, for strategic advantages, and for places where they could hide or build without being watched. Nazi Germany was particularly fascinated by the ice. They sent an expedition in 1938, led by a ship called the Schwabenland. They did not just go there to study penguins. They brought massive planes equipped with cameras, and something much more symbolic. They dropped thousands of steel markers, each decorated with swastika, across the snowy plains of a region they called New Swabia. Imagine that image for a moment. A vast, white, untouched wilderness being marked by cold pieces of metal falling from the sky. It was a claim of ownership made in a place where ownership feels impossible. This expedition sparked a fire of rumors that still burns today. People began to whisper about secret bases built into the sides of mountains and hidden submarine pens where U-boats could wait out the storms of the world. While historians say most of this was just a survey for a whaling station, the mystery of what they were really looking for remains. It was the first time that the modern world brought its darkest political shadows to the most pristine light on Earth. When the Second World War finally broke out in earnest, the secret games only intensified. The British government launched a clandestine mission called Operation Tabarin. It was named after a nightclub in Paris. Perhaps as a bit of joke, But the mission itself was very serious. They sent men to the Antarctic Peninsula to establish permanent bases. Officially, it was about weather reporting and asserting territorial claims. But secretly, it was about keeping a watchful eye on the southern oceans. They were worried that enemy ships would use the hidden coves and icy channels of Antarctica to hide and launch attacks on merchant ships. Think about those men living in small wooden huts, surrounded by thousands of miles of ice, while the rest of the planet was engulfed in flames. They were the lonely sentinels of the South. They spent their days measuring the wind and watching the horizon for ships that might never come. It was a war of nerves and isolation. It was a reminder that even when the world is in chaos, humans will reach for the most remote corners of the map to ensure that no space is left truly empty or truly free. But the most famous and mysterious chapter of this story happened just after the war ended. In late 1946, the United States launched what was called Operation High Jump. This was not just a small scientific trip. It was a massive military maneuvers. They sent a fleet of 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, and nearly 5,000 men to the ice. It was led by Admiral Richard Byrd, a man who had already become a legend for his earlier flights over the poles. To the public, it was an exercise to see how military equipment and personnel would handle extreme cold, but to many observers, the scale seemed far too large for a simple test. Why bring so much firepower to a landmass where there was no enemy to fight? The mystery of Operation High Jump has become the centerpiece for some of the most enduring conspiracy theories about Antarctica. People tell stories of strange encounters in the air and secret battles fought against hidden foes. They point to the fact that the expedition ended earlier than planned, and that Byrd gave a puzzling interview on his way home. He warned that the United States should take precautions against the possibility of an invasion by planes that could fly from pole to pole with incredible speed. In our modern world, we might explain this as a strategic concern about the Soviet Union and the coming Cold War. But in the quiet of the night, when you are thinking about the vast unknowns of the ice, those words take on a different weight. They suggest that Byrd saw something or felt something that did not fit into a standard military report. It makes you wonder if the iron and blood we brought to the South encountered something that we still do not fully understand. As the 1950s began, the secret wars shifted into a different kind of tension. The Cold War turned Antarctica into a giant chessboard. The United States and the Soviet Union began a race to build the most advanced stations in the most difficult locations. This was the era of the International Geophysical Year, a massive scientific effort that was supposed to be about global cooperation. And in many ways, it was scientists from different nations shared data and worked together in the harshest conditions. But beneath that cooperation, there was always a hidden competition. Every weather station was also a potential listening post. Every landing strip for supply planes was a potential military asset. The Antarctic Treaty was eventually signed to prevent the continent from becoming a battlefield, but the iron remained. Deep beneath the ice, at places like the South Pole Station, humans were building structures that looked more like moon bases and research centers. They brought nuclear power plants to the ice. They drilled deeper than ever before. They mapped every ridge and valley with radar, searching for secrets that were not just geological, but strategic. It is a strange irony that the coldest place on Earth became a hot spot for human ambition. We often like to think of Antarctica as a place that is separate from our history of conflict. We want to believe that there is at least one place where the better angels of our nature have won out. And in the treaty, that is largely true. But the story of the secret wars reminds us that we are a species that cannot leave a blank space alone. We bring our rivalries, our fears, and our hunger for power wherever we go, even to a place that was never meant to be explored, let alone fought over. Think about the wreckage that must be scattered across that continent. Old plane engines buried under 60 years of snow. Discarded fuel drums rusted by the salt air. Abandoned huts where men once sat in the dark, listening to the static on their radios and wondering if the world they left behind still existed. This is the iron and blood of our story. It is the proof that even the most beautiful and terrifying wilderness is not immune to our presence. And yet, despite all the metal we have dropped and the engines we have roared, Antarctica remains unconquered. The secret wars were fought in the margins. The bases were tiny specks on a continent twice the size of Australia. The ice has a way of swallowing our efforts. It grinds down the steel. It covers the markers. It silences the engines. In the end, the secret wars may have been more about our own anxieties than about the land itself. We were afraid of what might be hiding in the dark, so we brought our own shadows with us. As you listen to the quiet of your own room tonight, try to imagine that contrast. The blinding, pure white of the Antarctic interior and the dark, cold gray of a submarine slipping through the black water. The ancient, slow movement of a glacier and the sudden, sharp roar of a jet engine. It is a clash of timelines. The geological time of the Earth and the frantic, violent time of human history. Antarctica sits at the intersection of these two worlds. It is a library of the past, but it is also a graveyard for our 20th century dreams of global dominance. We are still there, of course. We still have our stations and our satellites. We still have our treaties and our secret protocols. But the secret wars showed us that no matter how much iron we bring, the ice will always have the final word. It reminds us that there are forces in this world that do not care about our flags or our markers. It reminds us that there is a difference between exploring a place and truly understanding it. Tonight, as we think about those men who lived in the huts and those pilots who flew into the whiteouts, let us reflect on the cost of our curiosity. We have spent billions of dollars and risked thousands of lives to pierce the veil of the South. We have looked for enemies, for resources, and for secrets. And what we found was mostly our own reflection. A reminder of our fragility. A reminder that some places are meant to be quiet. Some places are meant to be a mystery. Tomorrow, the sun will rise over the ice, just as it has for millions of years. It will shine on the research stations and the hidden wrecks alike. It will illuminate the paths where Admiral Byrd once flew and the valleys where the Schwabenland dropped its markers. But the snow will keep falling. It will add new layers to the archive. It will bury the iron and hide the blood. And in that silence, the real story of Antarctica will continue, indifferent to the wars we fight in our thoughts and on our maps. As you drift closer to sleep, let the weight of the iron fade away. Let the diesel engines go quiet in your mind. Focus back on the stillness. The secret wars are over, or perhaps they have just changed shape, but the ice is still there. It is waiting. It is breathing in its own slow, frozen way. It is a place where we are guests, even when we try to be masters. And perhaps that is the most important secret of all, that the Earth has its own agenda, and we are just a small, noisy part of it. Sleep well tonight, knowing that some mysteries are so large that even the strongest iron cannot break them. The South is quiet again, and for now, that is enough. In the next part of our journey, we will look at what happens when the ice begins to speak for itself. But for now, just let the cold beauty of the story settle over you like a gentle, heavy blanket of snow. There is no more conflict tonight. There is only the long, peaceful night of the polar winter. And in that peace, we can finally find our own rest. Antarctica is watching, and it is holding its secrets close, just as it always has. It is a land that was never meant to be explored, yet we could not stay away. And in that struggle, we find the true heart of our own restless story. The iron is gone. The blood is hidden. Only the silence remains. When we think about the history of human exploration, it is often a history of acquisition. We find a place, we map it, we name it, and then almost inevitably we claim it. We look for what it can give us: timber, gold, oil, or strategic advantage. That has been the pattern of our species for thousands of years. But Antarctica represents a rare and beautiful break in that pattern. It is the only continent on Earth where the flags planted in the snow do not mean ownership in the traditional sense. It is a place where we decided, for a brief moment in history, that curiosity was more important than conquest, that science was more valuable than sovereignty. This is the concept of a world held in trust. An entire landmass, bigger than Europe, kept in a state of intentional suspension for the benefit of everyone and the ownership of no one. It feels like a small miracle when you stop to consider the timing. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959. At that time, the world was a very different and much more dangerous place. The Cold War was at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense standoff, and the threat of nuclear conflict felt very real to people living through those days. Every corner of the map was being carved into spheres of influence. And yet, when these world powers looked at the vast, frozen emptiness of the southern continent, they did something unexpected. They stepped back. They agreed that Antarctica should be used for peaceful purposes only. No military bases, no weapons testing, no disposal of radioactive waste. They created a space where the rules of the rest of the world simply did not apply. I want you to imagine what that looked like on the ground. You have scientists from Russia and America, from the United Kingdom and Japan, from Argentina and Australia, all living in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Outside, the wind is howling at 100 miles per hour, and the temperature is 70 degrees below zero. In that kind of environment, political ideologies start to feel very thin. If your heating system fails or your food supplies run low, you do not care about the geopolitical leanings of the person in the next station. You care that they are another human being who can help. That shared vulnerability created a culture of cooperation that has lasted for over 60 years. It is a world where people share data, rescue each other in storms, and celebrate holidays together, even when their home countries are at odds. This is what it means to hold a world in trust. It is an act of collective restraint. It is as if humanity looked at this one last untouched wilderness and realized that we were not yet mature enough to handle its riches. We knew there were minerals under the mountains. We knew there was likely oil beneath the seabed. But we also knew that if we started fighting over those resources, we would destroy the very thing that made Antarctica special. The treaty was a way of saying, we are not ready for this yet. We're going to leave it alone until we can be better stewards of the earth. There's a quiet dignity in that decision. It turned Antarctica into the world's largest laboratory. Because we agreed not to own it, we were allowed to understand it. Without that treaty, we might never have discovered the hole in the ozone layer. We might never have been able to drill the ice cores that told us the history of our atmosphere. The silence of Antarctica allowed us to hear the whispers of the planet's past. By keeping the continent free from the noise of industry and war, we protected a record of who we are and where we came from. But holding a world in trust is not a permanent solution. It is a temporary agreement that requires constant renewal. In 1991, The nations involved took it a step further by signing the Madrid Protocol. This was an agreement that placed a total ban on mining and mineral exploration in Antarctica. It designated the continent as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. It was a massive victory for environmentalists and for the spirit of the original treaty. It ensured that for at least another 50 years, the mountains would not be scarred by mines and the valleys would not be filled with machinery. However, as we move closer to the middle of the 21st century, that trust is starting to feel a bit more fragile. The protocol comes up for review in the year 2048, and the world of 2048 will be very different from the world of 1991. We are facing a future where fresh water is becoming scarce, where minerals for our technology are in high demand, and where the melting ice might make previously unreachable resources easier to get to. There are already whispers of nations looking at the map with a different kind of curiosity. They are looking at the potential for fishing, for tourism, and yes, for the things buried deep under the ice. This brings us to a difficult question. Can a trust like this survive the pressures of a changing world? Antarctica was never meant to be explored in the way we explore other places. It was meant to be a sanctuary. But sanctuary only exists as long as everyone agrees to stay outside the gates. If one nation decides that its own needs are more important than the collective trust, the whole system could collapse. The very thing that makes Antarctica a miracle, the fact that it is a place of peace, is also what makes it vulnerable. It has no army to defend it. It has only a piece of paper and the shared conscience of humanity. As you listen to this, try to picture the physical reality of that trust. Think of the thousands of miles of untouched snow. Think of the hidden lakes that have not seen the sun in 15 million years. Think of the mountains that have never heard the sound of a drill. There is something profoundly healing about knowing that such a place exists. Even if you never go there, even if you only see it in photographs, the knowledge that there is a continent where we have chosen to be our best selves is a powerful thing. It is a reminder that we are capable of long-term thinking. We are capable of putting the needs of the future ahead of the greed of the present. In many ways, Antarctica is a mirror for how we treat the rest of our planet. If we can keep our promise to the ice, perhaps there is hope for the oceans and the forests. But if we fail in Antarctica, if we allow it to be carved up and exploited, it will be a sign that we have lost something fundamental. It would mean that there is nowhere left on Earth that is sacred, nowhere left that is beyond the reach of our appetite. That is why the concept of a world held in trust is so much more than a legal framework. It is a moral test. The scientists who work there today often speak of the continent as if it were a living thing. They talk about its moods, its power, and its terrifying beauty. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, that we are just guests there. We are allowed to stay as long as we respect the rules of the house. And the most important rule is that we leave it as we found it. We take our waste with us. We do not disturb the wildlife. We do not claim the land. We are observers, not masters. As we look toward the future, the challenge will be to maintain that perspective. It is easy to protect a place that seems useless or inaccessible. It is much harder to protect a place when you know it holds the keys to wealth or power. The true test of our trust will come when the ice melts enough to show us what we are missing. When the mountains are no longer ghost mountains, but real, reachable peaks filled with the materials we crave. That is when we will find out if the miracle of 1959 was a fluke or if it was the beginning of a new way of living on this planet. For now, the trust holds. The flag still flies side by side in the freezing wind, marking stations of discovery rather than outposts of empire. The silence remains the dominant sound of the continent, broken only by the crack of a glacier or the call of a bird. It is a world in waiting, a vast white archive of all that we have been and all that we might become. It is a place that reminds us that some things are too valuable to be owned. Some things must be held in trust, not just for ourselves, but for the earth itself. When you settle into sleep tonight, think of that quiet continent at the bottom of the world. Think of the researchers huddling together against the cold, sharing their findings and their friendship across borders that seem so important elsewhere. Think of the ice, miles deep, holding the secrets of 1,000,000 years in a frozen embrace. It is a world that was never meant to be explored for profit, but only for wonder. And as long as we can keep that wonder alive, as long as we can honor the trust, Antarctica will remain exactly what it needs to be, a reminder of what humanity looks like when it decides to be kind to the earth. The stewardship is a heavy burden, but it is also a beautiful one. It gives us a reason to look at the stars and the oceans with a sense of responsibility. It tells us that we are not just consumers, but custodians. And in the vast, cold silence of the South, that lesson is written in the very snow beneath our feet. A world held in trust is a world that still has a future. And as the night deepens, we can take comfort in the fact that, for now, the ice is still there, protected by our better nature, waiting for a tomorrow that we have promised to keep clean and quiet. For a very long time, we have spoken of Antarctica as a place that is still, a place where time does not tick, but settles in heavy blue layers. We have called it a vault, a library, and a fortress. But tonight, as the stars hang quiet over whatever window you're looking through, we have to acknowledge a different truth. The giant is waking up, and as it wakes, the armor that had protected its secrets for millions of years is starting to show the strain. It is a story of cracks and whispers and the sound of something massive beginning to shift. When we talk about the armor of Antarctica, we are talking about the ice, that incredible, miles-deep shield that has kept the continent hidden from our eyes and from the sun itself. For nearly 34 million years, that ice was a constant. It was the boundary between our world and whatever lay beneath. But lately, that boundary has become porous. We are starting to see the cracks. Imagine standing on a shelf of ice that is hundreds of miles wide. It feels solid. It looks like a permanent part of the earth. But deep beneath your feet, where the ice meets the dark water of the Southern Ocean, something is happening. The water is warming. It is not a dramatic heat, not the kind of warmth you feel on a summer afternoon. It is a subtle, persistent temperature shift. But for a continent made of frozen water, a few degrees is everything. This warm water is eating away at the foundations of the ice from below. It is a process that scientists call basal melting, but you might think of it as the earth slowly breathing on a window pane until the frost begins to thin. This is where the armor begins to fail. In West Antarctica, there is a place called the Thwaites Glacier. It is often referred in the news by a much more frightening name, the Doomsday Glacier. But let us look at it differently tonight. Let us look at it as a guardian. This glacier is the size of the state of Florida. It is a massive frozen wall that holds back a vast portion of the Antarctic ice sheet. It acts like a cork in a bottle. As long as it stays in place, the ice behind it remains stable. But the cork is loosening. Cracks are spidering across its surface. Long, deep gashes that tell us the internal structure is no longer as sound as it once was. If that cork ever pops, the giant behind it truly wakes up. It is a strange and beautiful irony, is it not? For centuries, we have wanted to see what was hidden. We have wondered what mountains and valleys and ancient mysteries lay under the white. And now we are starting to see them. But we are seeing them because the shield is falling away. We are glimpses of land that has not felt the wind in millions of years. New islands are appearing as the glaciers pull back. Small patches of rock that have been buried since before the first humans walked the earth. It is as if the continent is undressing, revealing a geography that was never meant for our eyes. Think about what that means for the library we discussed. If the ice is a collection of memories, what happens when those memories start to melt? When a glacier thins and the air bubbles from 100,000 years ago are released, that specific chapter of history is gone. It is breathed out into the modern world and disappears. The library is not just opening its doors. It is losing its pages to the wind. For the scientists who have spent their lives trying to read those pages, there is a sense of urgency now. They are racing to collect the ice cores before the data blurs, before the vertical timeline of the world becomes a pool of water. But there is more to this waking giant than just the loss of history. There is also the physical change in the silence. Antarctica has always been the quietest place on Earth, but that silence is changing. If you were to stand near the edges of the cracking ice shelves today, you would hear a sound that earlier explorers never knew. You would hear the groaning of the ice as it stretches. You would hear the thunderous boom of a piece the size of a city breaking off and crashing into the sea. These are the sounds of the armor failing. It is a heavy, resonant noise that echoes across the water like the heartbeat of something that has been asleep for an age and is finally opening its eyes. Perhaps we should wonder if we were ever meant to witness this. There's a reason the ice was so thick. There's a reason the continent was placed at the very bottom of the world, surrounded by the wildest oceans and the most brutal winds. It felt like a boundary. It felt like a promise that some parts of the earth will remain untouched. But our curiosity and our hunger for energy have acted like a sun that never sets. We have brought the heat of our civilization to the one place that needed the cold to stay whole. And now, the giant is not just waking, it is reacting. When the ice thins, the weight on the land changes. For millions of years, the earth beneath Antarctica has been pushed down by the incredible mass of the ice sheet. As that ice melts and flows into the ocean, the land actually begins to rise. It is a process called isostatic rebound. It is as if the continent is taking a long, slow breath after being held down for eternity. This shifting of the land can trigger volcanic activity that has been suppressed for eons. We know now that there are dozens of volcanoes hidden under the ice of West Antarctica. As the pressure of the ice armor lightens, some of those volcanoes might find the strength to erupt. Imagine a fire waking up under 2 miles of frost. It sounds like something out of a dream or a legend, but it is a very real possibility as the giant begins to move. And what are the mysteries we speculated about? The anomalies in the hidden structures? As the ice thins, our sensors get clearer. Our satellites can see through the cracks. We are finding more of those subglacial lakes, those isolated pockets of water that have been sealed for 15 million years. But as the ice shifts and the cracks deepen, those seals are no longer as perfect as they once were. The isolation is ending. We are finally getting the answers we wanted, but we are getting them because the vault is breaking open. There is a certain melancholy in that. We have always loved the mystery of Antarctica because it was a blank space on the map, but as the armor cracks, the blank space is being filled with data. We are losing the unknown and replacing it with the reality of a changing world. You might find yourself wondering, as you listen to the rhythm of this story, what it feels like for the people who are there right now. The researchers in their small stations, surrounded by the vastness. They tell stories of how the ice feels different than it did even 20 years ago. They speak of rain falling in places where it has only ever snowed. They watch the penguins move to new grounds because the sea ice they depend on is no longer there. For them, the waking of the giant is not a theory. It is a daily observation. They see the cracks in the armor. Every time they look at the horizon, they know that the silence they are experiencing is a fragile thing, a remnant of an age that is passing. The waking of Antarctica is a reminder that nothing is truly permanent, not even a continent of ice. We often think of ourselves as the main characters in the story of the Earth, but Antarctica shows us a different perspective. It shows us a scale of time and power that makes our cities look like dust. It reminds us that we are part of a very large and very delicate system. When we pull a thread in one part of the world, a crack appears in the ice 5,000 miles away. The giant is waking up because we have shaken it. And as the armor falls, we are left to wonder what we will do with the secrets that are finally being revealed. But let us take a breath and settle back into the quiet for a moment. Even with the cracks, even with the waking, Antarctica is still a place of immense beauty. There is still a majesty in the blue of the deep ice, and the way the wind carves the snow into shapes that look like waves. The armor may be thinning, but the spirit of the place remains. It is still the last great frontier. It is still the place where our imagination can wander and find peace. Perhaps the lesson of the waking giant is not one of fear, but one of awareness. It is a call to listen to the silence while it is still here, to appreciate the mystery while the vault is still mostly closed. As we think about the cracks in the armor tonight, let us think about the value of the things we cannot reach. Some secrets are more beautiful when they are hidden. Some stories are more powerful when they are whispered through the ice. The giant is stretching its limbs and the world is changing, but the wonder of Antarctica is still there, waiting in the cold. It is a reminder that we are small, that the earth is vast, and that there is still so much left to learn from the silence. For now, the armor holds, even if it is scarred. The history is still there, even if the pages are starting to turn. And as we drift towards sleep, we can listen to the echoes of that waking giant and find a strange, quiet comfort in the fact that the world is still capable of surprising us. The waking of the continent is a slow process, one that happens over decades and centuries. It is a transition from one age to another. And while we may be the ones to witness the cracks, we are also the ones who get to hear the story. It is a privilege to look at the edge of the world and see it moving. It is a privilege to wonder what the next chapter will be. So, let us settle in and listen to the final whispers of the ancient ice before the giant fully wakes and the map is changed forever. The armor may be thin, but the heart of the mystery is still beating. Deep beneath the blue, waiting for the morning that we have not yet seen. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists at the edge of the world. It is a silence that carries a weight, a heavy, ancient pressure that reminds anyone who hears it that they are a guest in a home that never sent an invitation. When we talk about frontiers, we often think of places that are waiting to be claimed. We think of forests that could be cleared, rivers that could be bridged, and soil that could be turned into fields. But Antarctica is not that kind of frontier. It is the last inhospitable frontier, a place that seems to exist in active opposition to human presence. It is a continent that does not just hold its secrets. It guards them with a ferocity that has broken the spirits and bodies of the most daring explorers for centuries. Have you ever stood somewhere so quiet that you could hear the blood moving in your ears? That is the baseline of existence in the deep south. It is a landscape where nature has decided that the rules of life, at least as we know them, simply do not apply. Tonight, we are going to look at why this land was never meant to be explored, and why, even with our modern satellites and heated suits, we are still little more than spectators at the edge of a great white stage. Before we go any further, I want you to take a second and check in with yourself. How are you feeling right now? If you're lying in bed, is a blanket pulled up just right? If you're sitting in a quiet room, Can you feel the stillness around you? It is quite a contrast, isn't it? To be somewhere safe and warm while we discuss a place that is famously the coldest, driest, and windiest spot on the planet. It is that contrast that makes Antarctica so fascinating. We are drawn to the things that push us away. We are captivated by the idea of a land that says no. And Antarctica has been saying no for a very long time. The first barrier to this frontier is not the ice itself, but the moat that surrounds it. The Southern Ocean is the only place on Earth where the water can travel all the way around the globe without hitting a single piece of land. Because there is nothing to stop the wind or the waves. They grow to a size that is almost unimaginable. Sailors throughout history have called these latitudes the Roaring Forties, the Furious 50s, and the Screaming 60s. It is a natural defense system, a turbulent barrier of gray water and freezing spray that keeps the rest of the world at a distance. For thousands of years, this moat was enough to keep the continent a myth. Even when the great explorers of the 18th century began to poke their ships into the fog, they were often turned back by icebergs the size of cities. It was as if the Earth was intentionally keeping this final chapter of its geography under lock and key. If you manage to cross that moat, you are met with a wall. The ice of Antarctica is not just a layer on top of the ground. In many places, it is the ground. Imagine a sheet of ice so thick that it weighs down the very crust of the Earth. If you were to take away all that ice tomorrow, the continent would actually rise up like a sponge being released from a heavy hand. This ice is sometimes 2 miles deep. That is taller than many mountain ranges. When we talk about exploring Antarctica, we are really talking about exploring the roof of a giant, frozen building where the floors are thousands of feet below us. It is a vertical frontier as much as a horizontal one. And because that ice is always moving, flowing slowly toward the sea like a river made of stone, the landscape is never the same twice. A path that was safe yesterday might be a hidden crevasse today, a bottomless blue crack covered by a thin, deceptive crust of snow. This is what makes it so inhospitable. It is not just the cold, though the cold is certainly enough to stop your breath. It is the unpredictability. It is a way the wind can pick up and create a whiteout in seconds, turning the world into a featureless void where there is no up or down, no left or right. In those moments, you are no longer an explorer. You are just a speck of dust in a vast, uncaring machine. People who have spent time there often speak of the psychological toll of this emptiness. We are creatures of color and sound and life. We are used to seeing birds or feeling the wind move through leaves or seeing the sun set behind a hill. In the deep interior of Antarctica, there's only white and blue. There's only the sound of your own breathing and the scream of the wind. It is a sensory deprivation tank on a continental scale. Isn't it curious that we are so determined to be there anyway? We have built research stations that look like space bases, perched on stilts to keep them from being buried by the drifting snow. We have sent machines to drill through the ice to reach lakes that have not seen the sun in 15 million years. But even with all of that, we have only scratched the surface. More than 99% of the continent is still covered in ice, and the land mass underneath it remains one of the least mapped places in the solar system. We honestly know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the valleys and mountains that sit beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. It is a frontier that remains closed, even as we stand on top of it. Maybe that is how it was meant to be. Perhaps there is a reason the Earth kept this place so well protected. When we look at the other continents, we see the marks of our history everywhere. We see the ruins of ancient cities, the scars of mines, the grid patterns of our farms. But Antarctica has no indigenous human history. It has no ancient ruins that we can easily find, no temples, no tombs. It is a blank page that has stayed blank for millions of years. For some, that is a frustration. They want to fill in the gaps. They want to find evidence of those lost civilizations we talked about, or proof that the Earth once looked very different. But for others, the emptiness is the point. It is a reminder that the world does not belong to us. There are still places that are sovereign in their own right, lands that exist for their own reasons, entirely independent of human ambition. As you listen to this, try to imagine what it would be like to stand at the South Pole tonight. It is a place where every direction you turn is north. It is a place where the sun only rises once a year and sets once a year. It is a world of total, absolute extremes. If you were to step outside of a heated shelter, the cold would not just feel like weather. It would feel like a physical weight. It would freeze the moisture on your eyelashes and turn your breath into ice before it could even drift away. It is a place that demands total respect because it offers no second chances. That is the true meaning of an inhospitable frontier. It is a place that does not negotiate. But even in that harshness, there is a strange beauty. There is the aurora australis, the southern lights, dancing in curtains of green and violet over the ice. There are the mountains that poke through the glaciers like the teeth of a giant, jagged and dark against the white. There is the knowledge that you are standing on a record of the earth that goes back further than our species has existed. Every layer of ice beneath your feet is a year of history, preserved in a perfect, frozen archive. It is a library of the world, but it is written in a language that we are only just beginning to translate. So we stay at the edges. We build our small outposts, and we send our drones, and we drill our holes. But we always know that we are there on borrowed time. The ice will eventually reclaim everything we build. The wind will eventually erase our tracks. Antarctica was never meant to be explored in the way we explore a forest or a city. It was meant to be witnessed. It was meant to stand as a reminder of the limits of our reach. It is the last great blank space on the map, and perhaps it should stay that way. There is a comfort in knowing that there are still mysteries that cannot be solved and frontiers that cannot be tamed. As we drift toward the end of this thought, I want you to feel that silence again. Not the harsh, biting silence of the wind, but the quiet, peaceful silence of your own space. It is nice, isn't it, to know that the world is big enough to hold both your cozy room and a continent of ice. We are safe here, in the glow of our curiosity, while the last inhospitable frontier continues its long, slow conversation with the stars. The ice is still there, the wind is still blowing, and the secrets are still tucked away, miles beneath the surface. And maybe just for tonight, that is exactly where they belong. The story of the ice is not over, but for now, we can let the mystery rest. Take a deep breath, settle into your pillows, and let the idea of that vast, white frontier drift into background. There's more to discover, always more to wonder about, but the silence of the South is a patient one. It will be there when you wake up, and it will be there long after we are gone. For tonight, it is enough to know that it exists. It is enough to know that the earth still has its secrets, and that the last frontier is still waiting, just beyond the edge of the world.